This Q&A is going to be about poetry, book writing, book publishing, mental health. So if any of that interests you, then welcome. Just to preface, my kitten's in here. So if you hear any noises, especially like scratching, if you see him zoom across the screen, it's fine. So also, while you're watching this video, if you have, here he is. If you have any other questions, maybe it's similar, maybe it's completely different, a different topic, the same topic, whatever, then you can leave it in the comments and I will answer it in another video. So the first question is, how do I title my book? So I'm not an expert, obviously, but I have written 2 books. And so kind of how I decided to title my book is, at first, whenever I started writing the books, I called them book 1 and book 2. And so I wrote maybe almost the entire first book, I think, before even coming up with a name. I wrote the entire second book with a completely different name, and then I changed it right before I published it. And so I would, for one, put writing or figuring out the title, especially if you don't have any ideas, put it off until the end of the book. You know, once you've written the whole book, you can kind of, oh Lord, you can kind of better gauge what the title should be. With that said, I write poetry books, and so I kind of look at the overall emotion and I title it based upon that. And so it took me a while to figure out what I wanted to title my first book, and I ended up titling it The Chaos Within. And I'm saying titled too much, and I chose that name because it was just a bunch of chaotic emotions. And in the beginning of it, I had a little letter to the reader, and it was talking about how there was just a chaos of emotions and it was not organized at all. It was just everything just right there, scrambled. And so I kind of thought of just like chaos, and then somehow I eventually got to The Chaos Within. My second one, I was going to title it Procrastinating My Emotions Within, and I liked that a lot because the overall idea of a lot of the poems and how I felt in the era that I was writing this was procrastinating emotions, not being very enticed. I don't think that's the right word, but to get better, just finding peace within all of the negative emotions. But however, because of how I wanted it to match, it wouldn't match like that. It would have created a whole circle because of how long that was. And so instead, I kind of shortened that idea and decided to call it Calm Within Chaos. It has a similar meaning, you know, like I wanted the core of it to talk about how you find peace and you find calm within your chaotic emotions and within all of the negativity, which is not a positive thing. Like, you should definitely try to find peace within calm, but it's just kind of expressing that idea. And so with your book specifically, the person who commented this being more of a traditional style book, it sounds like, than, you know, emotional poetry, you probably wouldn't go for the overall emotion. But if you think about the overall idea or one of the parts of your book that sticks out the most, maybe that's a character, maybe that's kind of a book trope, maybe it's an overarching idea, or maybe there's a lesson in the book. You know, you can start there. But honestly, for me, the title just started developing over time as I was writing it, as I finished it up. And so if you still can't come up with any ideas, maybe you could do a little bit of research on your end, and you could look at different books, especially the books that maybe inspired you to start writing. Maybe it's books that you've just enjoyed, you know, books that you've been around, books you've read, whatever. And so you can kind of think about the idea of their book and how they wrote their book, that type of thing, like what their book was about and then what the title was, and kind of gauge, you know, what yours should be about. So that's not really a direct answer, but it's kind of just how I came to mine. Like, it honestly just came over time. And so, like I say with a lot of things, my best advice is don't stress yourself out over it. It'll come to you eventually. So yeah, you don't need to have a title while you're writing the book. You just need to have one at the end. So understanding and utilizing poetry. So the second question is by Grace Robertson, I believe. And it says, do you have any tips for understanding and analyzing poetry? So I don't know if I'm the best person to ask this question to, if I'm being so for real. Personally, I have a really, really, really hard time understanding more like older style complex poetry. Like, I'm the type of person where if it doesn't specifically tell me, or if it doesn't clearly lead me to a clear idea, I have a very hard time understanding what it's talking about. Part of that is just, I don't know, maybe it's just not how my brain works. Another part of it is just reading. I have a horrible time comprehending what I'm reading. And the fact that you're doing it, I mean, if you're talking about taking French classes and then doing it on French poetry, I assume that you don't speak French as your first language. Maybe you're just now learning it. And the fact that you're analyzing poetry in a language that isn't even your first language is already amazing, honestly, because the only language I speak is English, and I can't even analyze poems in English. So the fact that you're doing it in another language is already impressive. But regardless, so my first advice would just be, if you're really struggling and need help with like analyzing poetry, I would go to videos, TikTok, maybe it's articles online, whatever, about people who maybe not do it for like a career, but it's a part of their profession or like everyday life, where they've been doing it for like decades. And especially people who can analyze stuff like Shakespeare and know exactly what it's talking about and stuff similar to that, you can look up different tips and stuff for that. But as far as the tips that I have and what I do whenever I'm trying to understand a poem is, honestly, this is kind of just me being a crappy reader or like struggling to read. But I mean, if you're doing it in another language, like, I mean, maybe this will help you. Maybe it's obvious, I don't know. But I break it down into sections and I read it in multiple ways. I read it in my head, I read it aloud, that type of thing, just to kind of get the best comprehension that I have. And I read it multiple times. And to be honest, if I can't understand what it's saying, I go line by line by line and just think about what the metaphors or what the language could actually be. And so the best advice I have for you is to break it down. If you can't understand a poem, or you can't understand some poems, maybe honestly, like, I'm a ChatGPT girly, just being so for real. AI is my bestie whenever it comes to stuff I need help with. And so if you went over to ChatGPT or AI or something and you asked for tips, like, what does this poem mean? Like, how do I analyze this? But then you also gotta understand in doing that it's a robot. So while it can sense emotion, it won't interpret it like a human can. And also poems, I feel, are interpreted in differently for every person that reads it. It means a different thing to everyone who sees it. And so I feel like it's up for interpretation. There's a lot of different conclusions you can come to when analyzing it, and so there's not really a wrong way to do it. But as far as like truly understanding whenever you're struggling, I'd say break it down and maybe get some tips or help from like professionals or AI, and just kind of read it multiple times, take your time, and just come back to it if you struggle with it. But yeah, I'm not really the best person to ask about that, just because, like, girl, I struggle so much with that. But I gave you the tips that I had, I guess. So the next question is from someone on TikTok, and their username is Lyrics for Your TikToks. And the question is, how do you start writing a poetry book? So I started writing poetry whenever I was 13. I wrote it about mental health. It was kind of like a diary entry to me. It was a form of just releasing what was in my head. And I started because I read mental health poetry from other book publishers, authors, whatever, and creators. And I found it to be very relatable and very helpful for me. And so I started writing my own. And at first, if you're talking about poetry specifically, at first I started writing it as a diary type of thing. So I was just releasing emotions. And then slowly over time, as I read a lot of other different types of poetry and different people's poetry, I slowly started developing my own poetic voice and kind of learning what poetry truly was and what I could do with it and that type of thing. And I kind of write a mix of poetry / prose type of deal. I hardly ever put rhyme in it. I don't follow any specific poetry types. I just go with free verse. And so I kind of just do what I want with it. And then as far as writing a book, I just wrote a ton of poems because it was just something that helped me and something that was one of my only interests during that time. It was like one of the only productive things I would do. And so I just wrote it, and I wrote it in Google Docs, and I put a poem to a page and eventually formed that into a book. And so that's kind of how I started writing my book. I just wrote a bunch of poems, scrambled them, and put them in book form. If you want to do it more organized, then that is up to you. But I just did Google Docs. And then as far as the cover goes, I did my cover in Canva. I pulled inspiration from a lot of, a lot of poetry books have like pictures in them. And then I've looked at a lot of book covers and I was like, okay, what aspects do I like about my favorite book covers and how can I incorporate that uniquely into my own? And so I kind of just played around in Canva a lot until I ended up with the idea that I published on my cover. So I don't know if that answers your questions or what you were going for, but I am going to answer some similar questions in the future of this video, so maybe that'll answer whatever I didn't cover. So the next question is by Poem Lover, and it says, I'm going to publish a poetry book, but don't know how. So this one's getting more into the aspect of actually publishing the book. And so as far as publishing goes, my first recommendation is do some research as far as the difference between like traditional publishers and self-publishing. I self-published through KDP, but I haven't done a whole lot of research in publishing it traditionally. And so if I were you, I would look into that a little bit before just deciding that you want to self-publish through KDP like I did. I would make sure that it's something that you want to do, because my book specifically, not saying it won't ever end up in bookstores, but my book is sold solely through Amazon, and that is the place that it will be. And so just realistically, mine's not going to be in Barnes and Noble and that type of thing, which honestly I'm okay with, just because a lot of people now shop online, and the odds of someone walking into a bookstore and finding my book and picking it up is way less than them finding me on social media and then buying it online through Amazon. It's just convenient for both me and the reader, I guess. And so it's what I prefer. And so as far as how I publish my book, if you end up going the Amazon KDP route, is, first, again, I made my cover through Canva. I had my book written on Google Docs. And so those were both the platforms that I used. Like, I didn't even use the pro version of Canva. I just did it basic, and then you just make an account with Amazon KDP, and then you fill out a bunch of like information, such as, personal information. You have to fill out some banking information because obviously you are going to get income from this, and so it needs to have a place to put it. And so you fill out some personal information, and then you go into the program, I guess you could say, and you start creating the book. But all you do is fill out a bunch of information in boxes, such as, your name, the book title, what you want the actual author to be. Like, my last name is not Rachelle, I just put what I wanted to be on the cover and inside the book and on the platform and everything, whatever. And then, you just follow the steps. You end up downloading the Google Doc and the cover you made through Canva, or you can make a cover with them or whatever. You just follow the steps, fill it all in, and then it gives you some recommendation type of deal as far as pricing goes, and then it's published. And so I like that route just because I have full creative freedom, and I'm the only one who has say. However, there are pros and cons to that. There are pros and cons to publishing through a regular publisher. So my first step for you would just be do a little bit of research and figure out which route you want to go. And if you want to go the KDP route, then that's how I did it. Also, I just want to also say, I don't know how traditional publishers work. I do know that there are probably young authors, so I assume that since they're your publisher, you can publish a book and become an author whenever you're below the age of 18 that way. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I do know that on Amazon KDP, you can become an author and publish your book below the age of 18. However, you have to have an adult sign off their name somewhere, not on the book, not anything like that, but it needs to just verify that you're not doing it alone just because you are under the age of 18, and then you can change that whenever you're older. Okay, so the next question is by Mr. Thorne, the author, and it says, how do I sound more professional in my writing? Is there a way to make vocab... Sorry, I wrote this weird. Is there a way to make the vocabulary what is seen in a standard book? I did not read that word for word because I paraphrased it and forgot how to read it on this paper, but the basic idea is, how do I sound more professional? So just to preface my journey in sounding more professional, just going off the first book, my first book, The Chaos Within. The very first poem I wrote whenever I was 14 maybe says, I have always been envious of those whose world crumbles around them, of those who have been betrayed in the worst ways imaginable. Because what is worse than having the same amount of pain, yet having reasons that amount to a kiddie pool in comparison to their emotion? Another poem. This is a very short poem. It says, sometimes I just wish that the rain would go away and come again a different day. And so my first book isn't very professional vocabulary. My first book I wrote whenever I was 14, 15. A lot of it is very, very basic vocabulary. Very, very straightforward. It's not very hard to read and comprehend just because my vocabulary is limited, and it was extremely limited back then. And so that's the first book. Whenever I get into my second book, I get more to the ages between 17 to 19. And if I just open it to a random page, I'll just read this one. I have always craved that sense of relief, that relaxation after a long day, that safe place where all your worries finally fade away. Home. That is what they call it. And on Thanksgiving, when sitting around the table, that is what I'm supposed to say that I am thankful for having. Yet most people fail to realize that having a good house does not immediately equate to having a good home. Life is hard when all you want to do is go home while sitting in your room, realizing you are already there. And so that poem of, like, it did it get a little better? Maybe. But again, basic vocabulary, basic language, not professional sounding. It's just, it's not a bad poem, but the vocabulary itself isn't any complex language. Now, if we get to poems in my little journal here that I've written recently that will probably be featured in my third book. If we read one of those poems, it says, "In this moment, between the rustling leaves and whistling wind, I saw her, a beautiful fawn dancing among wild flowers, a memory of who I once was. Her mind bore thoughts so bright, the halo around her serving as a reflection of her soul. In this moment, when her eyes met mine, it felt as if the earth had stopped spinning, the universe finally taking in a breath." So that's not the whole poem, but you get the idea. And so the language here is a little bit more advanced, kind of sounding, just because, it's saying, her mind, her mind bore thoughts so bright, a reflection of her soul. That's not really big words or anything, but the language is a little more complex. And honestly, two motivations for that. One, my sister kind of writes poetry a little bit for funsies, and so her vocabulary for some reason is just like 17 times as bigger than mine or whatever. And so reading her poetry and stuff not only motivated me to try and develop more complex language, but reading it itself slowly began to develop more complex language. And with that, as the second point, the more you read, the bigger your vocabulary grows. And so if you want to write more complex, professional word sounding poetry, then the best thing you can do is maybe get a poetry book, maybe don't, and just read a bunch of poems that has that more complex language that you're going for, because the more that you read it and the more that you analyze it, is the better and more advanced your vocabulary will get. I think that part of the reason why my sister and I's vocabulary in writing style is very different is because she read a lot of, not old poets, but older poets that have a lot more complex vocabulary, and I was more interested and read a lot more modern poets that had a lot simpler of vocabulary, and like clearly expressed a complex idea. If you could so look at it that way, my goodness. However, I am trying to develop into a bunch of different types of writing styles, and so I have been reading a little bit more complex or a little bit more abstract, and I probably should read more abstract in the future to try to like develop a little bit of diversity in my poetry. But yeah, and so whatever language that you want to be writing in and whatever vocabulary you want to have, the easiest way and the best way to develop that in your writing is to read it. Just to read the type of style that you want to write in, because the more you read, the more you'll soak in, and it will become part of your vocabulary too. And also, like I showed you, like it happens over time. Like the difference between the two vocabularies in the different poems is not extremely drastic. It is a clear difference between the first and the last, but it's not like a huge drastic change. And that happened over the course of 5 years. And so I'm not saying it's going to take 5 years, but it's not going to take 2 minutes. Like it's going to slowly develop over time, and that's okay. Now the last question is going towards a more mental health route, and so we can end the video on a mental health note. And it is from NB Fam. And it says, "Is it okay to mask yourself in public as long as you can remove the mask without removing your true self?" So if I'm just being so for real, I don't know if this is considered a mask, but I am completely different around 99% of people in my life and around me than I am whenever I'm alone and whenever I feel like my truest self. So the person that I am on camera, I would more put with my true self, as far as like on camera. I'm obviously like, I'm making videos, I'm going to talk more just because I have to talk in the video for this to work. And so I'm going to be talking more, but I feel like I'm more of a very expressive and vibrant type of person on camera, and I feel like that's kind of who I am whenever I'm alone and whenever I am around like a few people, maybe just like one or two. And my cats they definitely see my true self. But regardless, whenever, like, in high school, I'm out of high school now, thank God, but in high school, I was seen as quiet type of vibe. That's how I am around 99% of people I'm around. I'm very quiet. I don't really contribute much to conversation. I'm seen as like shy, I guess you could say, and kind of like the nice girl, you know, like the quiet, shy, nice girl in the back of your class. That's who I was. It's who I was viewed as, because that's how I portrayed myself. That's how I portray myself with a lot of people. You know, I'm talking like friends I used to have, family, almost all of my family, like everyone in my life, every single human being around me, other than maybe like one or two people, see me that way. And so I guess that could be considered a mask. I don't know, because it's just, I don't know if I want to say safer, but it's a lot more calmer, and it feels safer for me to portray myself that way and to act that way. I'm just someone, not only can I not talk a lot in big groups, I can't talk a lot in around most people just because of different things in my brain, I guess you could say. I have to feel very, very, very comfortable around someone to be able to talk freely and express myself the similar / same way I do on camera. And so if I'm being so for real, so the question was asking me, is it okay to mask yourself in public as long as you can remove the mask without like removing your true self? The person I am in public is not the same person as who I am in as far as like my true self goes. The person I am, even in like a family's house, like extended family, like genuinely everyone who knows me basically just knows my mask, if you're going to like phrase it that way, because I'm just not someone who can express myself around 99% of the human beings on this earth. And so that might change over time, especially with recording. I feel very, very myself whenever it's just me and a camera. And so I guess you're being exposed to my true self if you're watching this. However, I am not myself in person. And so honestly, it's fine. I wouldn't stress about it. I'd feel like some people's brains, I think, and I don't know if this has to do with mental health, brain wiring, personality type. I'd assume mental health. You just can't act yourself around a lot of people, especially in public. You know, you can get into like stress. I'm a very, very stressed person. It's my habit, and my favorite thing on earth to do is to stress about every little thing I possibly can. And so because of that, in public, especially around crowds, restaurants, you know, school, anywhere, I'm not going to be myself. I'm not going to talk. And that's not because I'm forcing myself to not be, you know, like whatever. It's just simply I cannot speak and express myself easily in public and around most people. And honestly, I feel like that's perfectly fine. If it's someone who's very, very close with me and who, you know, I feel very comfortable with, I feel very safe with, who I care for very deeply, they will know my true self and they will get to meet that person. And so honestly, in my brain, everyone will think and feel differently, but in my brain, as long as the closest people to you know your true self. And, you know, maybe you don't have anyone who's that close to you right now, but maybe that's one thing that's beneficial. You'll notice that when someone is very close to you, you'll know whenever you enjoy something, such as like the way I enjoy recording, because it just feels like me, you know, it feels like my true self. And so my mask looks nothing like who I am, and most people, especially if someone I know in real life is watching this, like, they'll probably just have no clue what I'm talking about as far as like true self goes. That was weird, because again, I'm just the quiet, shy girl in the back of the classroom in most people's minds, even not even in school, just in daily life and in family functions. Like, genuinely, that's just how I portray myself. And so it's okay, it's fine. I wouldn't stress about it. If you want to take off the mask, if you don't want a mask anymore, like, I mean, I don't even know if that's possible, but I guess you could take steps, you know, something that a therapist might recommend. Like, I don't know, I'm not a therapist, I ain't never been to therapy, and so I don't know, but I'd say don't stress about it. It doesn't make you a bad person, it's not a negative thing, it's just the way that your brain works, and it's who you are. Even if it's just who you are right now and it won't be who you are in the future, that's fine. If it's who you always are, that's fine too. Like, I wouldn't stress about it, because at the end of the day, as long as you know your true self and you allow yourself to be your true self, especially when alone or when around people you're comfortable with, I feel like that matters a lot more than whether you express that or mask it in public. So if you have any questions that you didn't hear get answered in this video, or in my past Q&A videos or my past videos, if it hasn't been talked about or discussed, then you can ask them in the comments, and I will either make a Q&A video answering them, or I will make a whole video about them, such as the most recent poem I wrote. I walked you through the process of it in a video, and I think it's called something like showing you, like, write a poem with me, or showing you my poetry writing process or something. And so, you know, that was a video where I did a whole topic in one video, or like one topic in one video, but a lot of the questions I just answer in Q&A. So if you want me to do a whole video showing something or answering something, then you'll have to be specific about that. But, you know, you can ask questions about poetry, writing, publishing, mental health, confidence, beauty, skincare. I mean, literally anything. I'm more of a poet type of girly, and writing questions, but let's just be so for real, 99% of my poems I write about is mental health. And even though I'm not a therapist and I don't have all the answers, and my answers might not even help a lot, I have had the issues my entire 19 years of being alive on this earth. So, I mean, maybe I'll be somewhat of a help to you, you know. But regardless, thank you for watching this video. I hope these answers helped you, and I hope you have an amazing day.